Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to the anniversary session of our SUG Columbus. Today is the day we have completed 1 full year, and this is beginning of the next year for SUG Columbus. We had many good sessions in last 1 year. We have 12 sessions, 1 session every month we have in last 1 year, and we had almost more than 15 speakers in last 1 year. And today we are having a session from Akshay and Kamruz. Himadri, can you introduce them? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I don't think there's too much introduction needed for these guys. They are quite known in the community and doing Sitecore community work for so long. So Kamruz and Akshay both are what Kamruz is probably 10 times Sitecore MVP. Akshay is long in this community, and he does the he started the hackathon, which is all we actually join. So today they are going to talk about architecture in composable DXP world. This is something going on in the Sitecore arena. As we know that there are a bunch of companies that Sitecore bought, and they are moving towards the composable architecture. So it's a hot topic. So yeah, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks again, guys, for joining us. So as Himadri said, today we'll be talking about what the role of a Sitecore architect is in a composable DXP world. Has it changed? What do we need to do? Do we need to do anything different? So my name is Akshay Sura. I've been an MVP for quite a few years. I've done a lot of community work. With me here today.
And my name is Kamruz Jaman. I've been a Sitecore MVP for 10 years and in the current Sitecore space for around 13 years. So let's start with what is Composable DXP. And as Himadri just said, there's been a lot of changes in the CMS space in the last few years, and especially within our own Sitecore world. And in case you've been living under a rock, Sitecore's been buying up composable related companies like it's going out of fashion. So past few years, we've seen Content Hub come on. We've seen Order Cloud, Moosefend, Personalize, which was and the CDP, and Reflection for search. There's, I think I might have missed a couple of bits, but yeah, there's been a lot of movement in this composable space, and it's the big buzzwords, right? So let's start with what is a monolith or a traditional CMS versus a composable DXP. The traditional CMS, like the Sitecore XMXP stack that we've been used to, is where everything, it's an all-in-one system. So we are dealing with the content management aspects of the content itself, but then we also head straight into the orchestration layer and the presentation layer. So, and they are built on top of the content management system using the CMS's own proprietary SDKs. You may also have other systems within this monolith to supplement functionality such as personalization, search, analytics, emails, marketing automation, even e-commerce and any other multi-experience systems. The composable DXP works slightly differently. Typically, they're cloud-based SaaS systems, and they typically work as separate pieces. So each specific system has a specific responsibility. So you'll have a system for the content, you'll have a different system for the analytics, you'll have another system for the personalization, you'll have another system for the e-commerce, and then you will build an integration between all of those systems and tie in all the presentation to build your final product. That's where the term composable DXP comes from. You are taking multiple different systems, you're composing them into a single digital experience platform that works together and more seamlessly. Transitioning to a composable DXP strategy will give your marketers unprecedented freedom, because you can pick and choose the exact systems that you want and what you need for your specific requirements for that specific customer and that specific. In fact, Gartner themselves are now saying that you should be aiming to a composable DXP strategy to future-proof your tech stack. Again, because you can just pick and pull the systems that you want, that you need. They will meet the needs of your customer for that specific moment in time. And if they don't in the future, you can just pull something out and replace it with something else in the future to meet that need.
Yeah, and also like choosing the best of breed doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of everything you have and then replacing it with like to like some other technology. It basically means that you can reuse what works for you and find things which you need. Most of the time we have 15 things, we don't necessarily use all 15. So from a composable perspective, you keep the ones which you're currently using. When you do need something, you either reuse something which you already have or find something which fits your purpose. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best of breed for the rest of the world. It has to be best of breed for your problem. So you need to look at it more from an agile method and not all at once. So get what you need and you reuse what you need before you go and find something which you want.
So let's move on to talking about Jamstack, because that term is quite synonymous with composable, and it's used a lot. It's mentioned a lot. So Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's a modern architectural pattern for web development, and it's based on using client-side JavaScript, making use of reusable APIs, and then layering that on top of pre-built markup, pre-built HTML. The way it generally works is there's a number of different platforms that you can use, frameworks that you can use to build your markup. The most popular one right now is Next.js, but you may have come across systems such as Hugo, Gatsby, or even some of us old timers, something like Jekyll, for example. There's probably, I'd say, the original static site generator. And then you build a bunch of APIs, or you can use APIs that are available from other systems, such as headless CMSs or e-commerce systems. You may have used these APIs for search functionality in the past, for example, for displaying search results on a page. And then you have a bit of JavaScript, which will hook up the APIs and then render that onto the markup and provide some dynamic type of functionality. You can use something like React with Next.js, but even if you want to go really old school, you could use plain old JavaScript to just call these APIs and layer it onto the markup, or jQuery. You've probably done stuff with jQuery, and again, the search results. The concepts are fairly similar, but there's a big movement towards this Jamstack approach because it comes with a number of benefits.
So from a benefit perspective from Jamstack, we've been doing it for the past 3-4 years now. And honestly, based on what we are experiencing, just purely in terms of, people just throw out the word, oh, it's cheaper. But what you have to realize is it's cheaper from multiple different levels. So cheaper run rate, like what it costs you per month, if you include licensing, infrastructure, anything. Cheaper to build because the developers you're looking for this are not specific to like specialized like Sitecore. You don't need to technically know Sitecore to build Jamstack sites. So you're able to get React developers, give them an endpoint and say, okay, pull it from this endpoint and get it done. Secure by default. Before we used to run a multiple security scans, fix them, rerun it, do performance testing. We don't really have to do anything. Like we really don't have to go look at even deployments. They just get done in like 3 minutes in each environment and you're just done. So from that perspective, like we've been really, really happy with it. For us, one of the biggest thing is, I personally haven't used Docker in like the last 2 years, but it's so easy when we have a new developer for them to be up and running in 10 minutes. Yeah, we complain about the node modules folder, but at the end of the day, what's 10 minutes compared to hours trying to get your machine up? The machine doesn't have to be really powerful. It's super easy to get in there. The best thing is when we have the developers look at the documentation, because it's API first, all of these headless systems, they're very well documented and self-explanatory, and they have good support. So if you can't figure it out, which you most likely would be able to, you can always reach out. So the dev experience has been really amazing, from like setup all the way to running it on their local and getting it working.
Yeah, I should say when we first came into this space, the documentation and how good the documentation was really, really refreshing. They are, as actually mentioned, these systems are typically API first, so they have to be documented and they have to be well documented, because we can't crack open .peek to try and figure things out in this case, right? If we started to poke around someone's APIs too much, we might end up with a knock on the door from the police because we're attempted hacking or something like that. So they have to be documented well. A lot of them do have free trials that you can sign up to, and some of them have free developer instances to be able to use their services. So that was really good. We didn't need to be a partner. We didn't need licensing. We just get up and running, read the documentation. Some of them have online learning, sometimes even for free. They have good samples available, so you could get up and running and have a little play, and it doesn't cost you anything. So that was quite nice to be able to do without having to go jump through a whole bunch of different hoops like that.
And the other thing, which is super important, and this is kind of hard to get it unless you're in it, is one size does not fit all. What I mean by that is, for one of your customers, you find your perfect stack based on their needs. Doesn't necessarily mean that same stack will work for another project for the same customer or another customer, because you're trying not to fit technology into a problem. You're trying to figure out what the problem is and find the right technology. So the headless vendor might not be the same, the commerce vendor might not be the same, the deployment might not be the same, either because that's not your choice or because that doesn't work for that customer. So you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at it, is that one size does not fit all. It changes depending on the needs of the customer.
Yeah. And sometimes the customers will bring tech stacks themselves, or they already have existing tech stacks, right? So you can't always pick the stack for them. Sometimes they have preferences on hosting and sometimes they have preferences on their own hosting stacks as well, due to internal policies. But for us, when we started looking at this space, we came up with a list of requirements that we wanted to fulfill from the different systems. Obviously, coming from the Sitecore space, there were certain things that we were used to, and certain things that our customers would want, at least, or need to meet their requirements of their teams. And we went through a whole host of different systems, and that we spent quite a bit of time reviewing and going through demos and playing with different systems to see what worked best for us, and then we came up with a bit of a short list. And in terms of the feature list, I think what we really have to ask ourselves is, are we using all of the features of the Sitecore XP platform? Sitecore is very, very feature rich, and if people use them properly and well, then they can, you can do a lot of good things with it. But most of the projects we ended up being on were not using the features that they were sold on, or because of multiple reasons, right? Either it was too difficult to implement, or the business, they just didn't have the required business buy-in for them, or they couldn't get the expertise, or people were not following up on those personalization plans and that kind of stuff. And the things we ended up with on a lot of projects were very, very basic personalization, which were things that had been implemented by developers, like geolocation-based personalization or something simple like that. Most of the projects were just using Google Analytics in the end anyway. And personalization isn't just one of these things where you implement it during the development phase and then you leave it. It has to be taken seriously. It needs good business buy-in. So we were finding that around 80%, and we're not using personalization, which is Sitecore's biggest strength. So we really have to ask, what other features are we using in XP, and if we're going to be looking for those features, do we actually need those right now, especially?
So what does being a Sitecore architect in Composable DXP world mean to me? So for me, the biggest challenge was to just understand the scope of things. You just have to think a little bit differently. So I think we've all worked in technologies where we've pigeonholed ourselves into a specific technology. We don't necessarily try to find a solution to the technology solution to the problem that we don't know of, and that's probably not the right way to think of it. I think you need to look more in terms of, okay, what are the pain points for the customer or for this project? What technology, which either I know or someone else knows, that can solve this? And I think right now we're just because some of us work for other consulting companies where you're only allowed to work on Sitecore stuff. If you wanted to introduce another technology, it's another department's problem. So it kind of like either that or different other factors are making us focus too much on one thing, and we just have to think of it a little bit differently. Think of it more as decoupled systems. Think of a lot of reuse of, hey, they are already using Marketo. Why don't I just integrate Marketo in terms of embeddable forms or how contacts are tracked, rather than trying to, for instance, look at Sitecore Send, because that would disrupt a lot of things and duplicate a lot of efforts. So you just have to approach it a tiny bit differently.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at what the role of an architect is. Wikipedia defines it as a software development expert who makes high-level decision choices and tries to enforce technical standards, including coding standards, tools, and platforms. And I think, like, even with my role and Akshay's role, working as architects in the Sitecore world, I think it has become quite blurred as architects. We have, because we've grown up as developers, we tend to be still quite a bit in the weeds, with the code and writing code and fixing bugs and that kind of thing. But typically, like in this space, we've been writing less and less code, and we're working with more and more hybrid tech teams. I think we've been kind of getting used to that, with having a front-end team, a back-end team, maybe some full-stack developers, UI people, UX people. Those of us growing up with JSS over the past few years probably have become more accustomed to this, where you have a front-end team who are experts in React, back-end team who are experts in Sitecore doing, rendering resolvers and that kind of stuff, and making the back-end changes to Sitecore and deployments and all of those things. So as an architect, you have to ask yourself, should you really be actively coding on a project? Do you need to know 100% of the tech that's being used in a project? Can you even keep up with all of the tech if you were to do that, right? I mentioned earlier with the front-end stack that we're using is React with Next.js, headless CMSs. These are just APIs, so it doesn't matter, with the cell in the back end, a bunch of Azure functions and things like that. So how much of that should you know inside out as an expert, as an architect, or should you just know overall concepts? I mean, even within the Sitecore space, how many of us can truly say that we are 100% Sitecore experts? I know the core CMS very, very well, but do I know JSS inside out? Do I know the rendering host inside out? How about EXM or marketing automation? Or now we're bringing in things like Order Cloud and Lucent and things like that. Even back in the day, commerce, right? We all had our areas of expertise even back then. So maybe it's better to hire the talent that you need. So the role of an architect is very blurred within the Sitecore space, I found. And we really should be on the lookout for technology that best fits the needs of that particular problem, rather than throwing the tech stack that we know at it and that we're most comfortable in working with only.
So what we did is we gathered a couple of architecture diagrams. Some of these might make sense to you. Some of them have commas, some of them don't. But pretty much all we're looking for is we have some source code, we have DevOps, something like an Octopus deployer, similar tool, which deploys it to our environments. And if you look at our environments, we have quite a few different roles, right? So we use a lot of SQL, we use a lot of servers to do different things inside of Sitecore. At the end of the day, we use some kind of a CDN and the user reaches it. That's pretty much a typical Sitecore architecture diagram. And here there's another one where we're adding a few more things. So we have a widen dam and river PIM, SAP, and a couple other tools. These are actual architecture diagrams of the customers we've helped move more towards the composable space. What we realized is we do in the work we do, and the one slide is not enough for this, but we all have done so much work in integrating other external systems into our Sitecore Monolith platform, right? To either send out emails or store personalization in a different system like Eloquor, CDNs, forms, you name it. We all have done it, and one slide will not do justice. So in my mind, now adding these external services to the architecture diagrams I already showed you, if you look at it now, we are using Google Analytics for analytics. We're embedding forms using a different thing. We're using a campaign manager to do other things, calling Azure functions to do things for us. So we're already kind of integrating with external systems. So in my mind, what I want to ask Kamruz is, aren't we already composable then if I'm already talking to all these different kind of systems?
Well, you are, right? You're kind of composable. So you're using a bunch of headless composable services, applications already in your system. But then you also have the monolith on that you're building this on top of. So you're kind of on this hybrid model where you have the best of some worlds, but then not the best of all worlds, right? So Composable DXP itself does bring a number of advantages, right? There are a number of advantages of using composable DXP systems. Some of the top ones are they are typically omni-channel systems. So with the Sitecore world, we're typically very, very web focused, and with the omni-channel and a headless system, you could be targeting multiple different systems. So it could be the web, it could be mobile devices, it could be some cataloging system, it could be in-game play. We've seen systems where computer games are actually sourcing their content from headless CMSs, for example. Typically, composable systems are headless first, and they follow an API-based approach, and they take a microservices type of approach to building those out. So you are usually having a best of breed for each particular system. They are typically SaaS by default, cloud-based SaaS by default, which also gives you the advantage that upgrades and bug fixes and things like that are happening automatically in the background. They're fully managed. You don't have to worry about uptime, downtime, or even scaling globally if you need that. And security and everything else that goes with that, right? So I don't have to deal with any of the security aspects and testing and everything else on that. They are technology agnostic. Mentioned that they are API based, headless and API based. So it doesn't matter what technology you use to connect to them. So we typically are using things like React and Next.js, but you can easily use .NET Core, Java, PHP, Ruby, whatever you like. Each of the composable DXP systems is typically best of breed. They do one thing and they do one thing very, very well. So you are getting very focused attention on that technology stack. You can also avoid vendor lock and vendor lock in two ways. One is because they are API based, it is, say, not easy, but it's fairly easy to rip out one system and replace it with another, especially if you're using something like GraphQL to write your backend queries. Most of the GraphQL will be very, very similar, and you can structure them in a way that if you need to replace out a system in the backend, you can do that fairly easily. We did this fairly recently where we started with one e-commerce vendor and then partway through implementation found that it wasn't doing what we were expecting it to do. So we were able to replace that with a different system. And it wasn't easy, but it was still easier than we've been typically used to. The other thing is with vendor lock is also the agency partners that you're using, because these are very, very open systems with APIs, GraphQL, etc. Your partner agencies don't have to be very, very specific in the expertise that they have in a Sitecore-like system, right? Where it's very, very niche and very, very specific knowledge. Switching from one system to another headless system is typically almost the same, not exactly the same, but almost the same. So equally finding, moving from one partner agency to another agency is also opened up and gives you a lot more choice. And because these systems are headless and very easy to onboard, cloud-based and very easy to onboard, you can respond to the changing business needs very, very rapidly. They're usually very, very easy to integrate as well onto the existing tech stack once you have a bit of experience with working with them. There are some disadvantages though, that always comes with every system. The first one being that it's not web specific, and I know I mentioned in the last slide that they are omnichannel as being an advantage. But typically with the systems that it doesn't matter which way you cut it, the web is still the main channel and the biggest channel for most customers. So because it's omnichannel, there's certain things that doesn't come with it being not web specific, such as like URLs. A lot of the systems don't have the concept of URLs, and you need to be able to deal with that as a vendor. And there's other things like not having metadata, for example, built into the system. So you have to cater for those, and you have to figure out how you build those kinds of things into your systems. There is a lot of choice out there for headless systems. There's a lot of systems, a lot of vendors, and you're going to be faced with a bit of choice paralysis when you first start. We had the same issue. We spent a lot of time going through reviewing and shortlisting and demoing lots of different systems, and you'll eventually come to a handful of systems that you are most comfortable with. But like I say, if a customer comes with a system of their own choice, it's just a headless system, I'm sure you'll be fine figuring out what the APIs are, especially given that they had good documentation. There is no out-of-the-box functionality, so it is just a headless system in the cloud. It doesn't do anything. You won't get a pretty website at the end of it. We're probably used to that with Sitecore, because all we get is a welcome to Sitecore's homepage. But a lot of these vendors do have samples and starter kits that you could build off of, and give you a bit of a boost to start off with. It would be nice if there was something more SXA like, with some templates and some themes and that kind of stuff. Sitecore at SiteCon mentioned that they are working on something for their set of products, so that'll be interesting to see what they come up with in terms of those kits. There's also no dashboards or controls, so you have lots of disparate systems, and you need to build something in order to create essentially a launchpad like we have in Sitecore, to tie all of those systems together, at least give a jump point for your customers to be able to head into the different systems that they're going to be using. This is something else that Sitecore is going to be providing with their suite of products, at least, and giving a portal to allow that control, and maybe with the SSO tie-ins, who can access what systems. So that would be quite nice again. There are no visual editors as well, because these are headless systems. They don't know how you have implemented them. There are some vendors that provide some integrations with visual editors, so you need to have a look at if that is important for you. Again, this is another area that Sitecore is going to be providing some functionality into in the near future. They again mentioned this at SiteCon, that they have a front end as a service system coming out called Symphony, which is going to build on top of Horizon.
Yeah, here's again looking at one of the solutions which was turned completely into composable. As you can see, it's still the same. We have a code repository. Vercel's taken over in terms of instead of our DevOps and Octopus. We have still a headless CMS for one of the architecture diagrams. All the external services remained the same. Obviously, the search was swapped out. We no longer need Solar. We could use anything we want. In this case, Elastic was our thing. Well, what's pretty important in this diagram is that there's a lot of Azure functions in the middle. So any kind of serverless functions will become your friends. So all your .NET developers, you're not redundant. So there is a lot of backend work still which needs to be done in terms of calling hooks, getting scheduled tasks done, things which need to be processed. So keep in mind that when you go into a very composable architecture, serverless functions will become your best friends. So if you go to the next slide, this is another one with the commerce involved, where you can see that there's a headless CMS and a headless commerce. The external services all remain the same, but there's a lot of interactions happening between all of these systems and your deployment systems using Azure functions. In this case, you could use any serverless functions, but things like you need to pull and push image metadata from your CMS. You need to sync between, some lookup information on your CMS into the headless commerce. You need to upload data feeds, process them, push them back into commerce, or you need to sync the images between your DAM and your commerce system. Like you need to, every time someone publishes in a headless system, if it's for the web channel, you want it to trigger a build on Vercel or whatever your deployment system is. So all of that work is done via Azure functions, but the rest of the external services pretty much remain the same. It's just how you deal with all of them. So, I mean, this is a really, really important slide, and we kind of follow this to a T in the sense we don't talk about technology at all. So we look at it more from a business-driven problem issue. We talk to all the stakeholders, anyone who touches the information to the channel which goes through, whether it's mobile, whether it's website, whether a product team, a printing team which sits somewhere and physically prints catalogs, whatever the team is, it's a matter of talking to all of them to see what the existing pain points are, especially when you're trying to re-platform on a composable DXP. Talk to them, figure out what the problems are, and do not have a technology in mind when you're looking at the problems. Have ideas, great, but don't already try to slot in, this marketer would be perfect here, or Salesforce would be great here. That's not what you're thinking. You're trying to collect all of the issues. Once you do that, you try to figure out if there's already something in the company where people love it. A lot of the companies love Google Analytics. They're entrenched into it, Google Data Studio, Google Tag Manager. There's no point bringing in another analytics vendor when they're already happy with it. So you're trying to figure out what do we use and what to look for, which fits them the best, not what's in the market considered best of breed, what is best of breed for that particular customer. So you're not looking at, I'm taking a CMS out, I'm going to put a CMS in. That's not the way you need to think. It needs to be more business problem solving, not a technology fitting into a specific problem.
Yeah, we also found that the development lifecycle is quite different with a composable and Jamstack approach. So typically with Sitecore development, we see, we have a requirements gathering phase, and then the UX team will come up and build out a bunch of wireframes. They'll hand those over to the visual design team, who will create some nice, pretty images, and then that gets shooted over to the front-end dev team, start to create some HTML files and images, cut those images up in CSS, JavaScript, etc. We'll hand that over to the backend dev, who'll start to integrate that into your Sitecore environment, into your Sitecore solution, and then you build and deploy and you build and deploy, and somewhere down the line you are ready to kind of go live, and the content entry team works like crazy to fill in all the content and build in all the pages. And somewhere way down the line, we have this mythical phase 2, which never ends up happening, but it's supposed to be doing all the big and nice personalization things. With the composable development lifecycle, we typically found we can parallelize a lot of this work. Requirements gathering is still hugely important, as actually just mentioned. It's key for a lot of these implementations. But we still have that UX implementation phase, some visual design. And once we got that in, the front-end development, the back-end development, and the content entry can almost happen in parallel. The information architecture is important for the content entry because it's going to define what your templates and your content models look like. But the front-end team, those templates can be implemented directly into the composable DXP system that you're using, the SaaS system. You put your credit card details in, the SaaS system is up and running. You can start creating the content models, those content entry teams can start inputting content. The front-end team can now start building actually against live data, right? Almost, they can start building out their front-end, the front-end site immediately, and they're not, again, building against lorem ipsum. The backend dev team can equally be doing whatever they need to be doing using their Azure functions to import data, export data, run nightly updates, or whatever they need to be doing. And then you can add features and services when you need them. So I don't need to be adding commerce if my system doesn't need commerce today, or I don't need to be adding personalization right now and be burdening myself with the additional overhead of having to think about it even, or to manage infrastructure, or to work against a code base that isn't going to be using it for another year, 2, 3, 4 years, or whatever that is.
And then this term gets thrown out quite a bit. So content modeling in the very headless CMS world. All of us who've used Sitecore for a long time, we've been doing this by default, right? So every time you are trying to figure out a Sitecore solution, you're thinking about data templates, you're thinking about template inheritance, you're thinking about how exactly standard values, all of the fun stuff. That to me is content modeling. The only difference you have to keep in mind is you have to keep it channel agnostic as much as possible. So you're trying to keep the data as clean, so it can be used by a mobile app, it can be used by web, it can be used by anything we need to. And you will end up with some templates which will have channel specific attributes, but the core of the data, like authors or articles or press releases or whatever it is, you try to keep it as clean as possible without channel specific information. That's pretty much what content modeling is. And then visual editors, I think Kamruz mentioned it a little bit. So I call it page editor still. I'm old, so that's fine. But page editor or experience editor, it's still the best one out there. There's no question about it, right? So you can customize it to whatever you want. You can make it very complicated. You can do what it needs to do. Yes, it's slow. fine. I get it. We all have our own problems with it, but at the end of the day, it is a good page editor. You are not going to get that in the composable world. It's simply because the concept itself, when you talk about a headless CMS's job is not to visualize content. Headless CMS's job is to store content, provide you the content, give all the tools for the authors to be able to add the content. What happens to the content once they provide it is not the headless CMS's job. So you have to keep that in mind, where headless CMS is channel agnostic. It's omni-channel content, right? So they don't really have to do it, but there are some tools out there. So Builder.io is a good one. Stackbit is another one if you want to use it. Some content management systems like Content by Kentico already come with Web Spotlight. They're pretty decent, but they're never going to be as good as an experience editor.
Yeah, they really are like separate tools, right? So it's a different way of getting used to. So some systems that we've used, headless systems, they don't have anything at all, and the authors just get used to working in that different way. So it's about expectations and how and showing people how to use those particular tools. Sitecore at SubCon, so I mentioned this earlier, did mention that they are coming up with a new editor called Symphony. It's going to be building on top of Sitecore Horizon. It's a front end as a service, and what they had told us was it's a experience editor, page editor like visual editor, but it would be able to pull from multiple different systems. So it wouldn't just be a Sitecore specific product. It would be able to pull from Kentico by Content or Contentful was the two examples I had given. So it should be interesting to see what happens with this tool. Sitecore obviously has very good history with providing this type of editor and providing that good experience for creating composable pages. But I think it's important to note that composable in the DXP sense doesn't necessarily mean that it's composable in the page editor itself. A lot of people have taken very template-based approach to creating actual pages rather than a composable approach to creating pages. So let's move on to what it means to be a .NET developer in the composable DXP world, because both of us are from the .NET world, and we have teams that are from the Sitecore world, .NET developers, and one of the questions that everybody is asking themselves is, does that mean we are now redundant? Because what role am I going to play? What I keep hearing about is that composable sites are written in JavaScript and React and Next.js, and I'm not a front-end developer. Can we even do anything with .NET Core? Is that an option? I think the first thing to mention is that Jamstack and Composable are used quite synonymously, but they are you can definitely do one without the other, right? I can be doing Jamstack without composable systems, and I can be doing composable without using a Jamstack approach. And in any case, .NET can be a very integral part of your stack and your solutions. It is for us. We use it a lot with Azure Functions, for example. We still write all of our Azure Functions in C#. .NET developers are very much a core part of our teams. A lot of teams are very used to being multi-skilled anyway. I mentioned the JSS example earlier, and you have front-end teams who are split between React on the front end, or Angular, or Vue, or whatever that is, and then the back-end teams are doing all of the Sitecore integrations, which would have been written in C#, right? The other thing is before we moved on to the very specific Sitecore stack, we were just .NET developers. We would work with any and all systems, and we just I personally just loved writing code and coming up with solutions to problems rather than being given, hey, this is what we have to use to come up with the solution, right? Being an agnostic technologist will also be opening up your job prospects a lot more. You're not then pigeonholed into just working on Sitecore systems. You can be working on any system, which is headless or composable. So you can create composable solutions using whatever languages and technologies you want. You are just working against the headless REST-based APIs. There are a lot of examples from a lot of vendors on providing solutions in JavaScript, .NET, Java, Ruby, whatever. It doesn't really matter. If you wanted to take a Jamstack approach, which is where you're statically pre-generating the sites, you can use, there is a Jamstack framework called Static. It's a static site generator, which is .NET Core based. And for a lot of us Sitecore developers, it will be, the concepts at least will be quite familiar. So rather than, they have a concept of pipelines and modules, which is the equivalent of having a pipeline and a processor, right? So you throw a document in, it will then run through a set of pipelines, and each pipeline has a bunch of modules which then modify and add and remove and whatever from that document, and it spits out a static HTML file that you can then deploy up onto Vercel or Netlify, or throw it up into a static Azure website. Just be a little bit careful with static. So when we started looking at, this was one of the frameworks we had looked at. We eventually obviously settled on Next.js for multiple reasons. But what we found is these pure static site generators, so SSG, are very, very good as POCs or for small websites. But when you back that up onto a headless CMS, especially, you go from like 10 pages, 50 pages, and a build time of 30 seconds, 1 minute, and then you go to like 200, 300, 400 pages, and the build time goes up to like 2-3 minutes, which you're like, okay, it's still fine. But then you start to throw in things like e-commerce at it and statically generating product pages, and you go to like 10,000 pages, and all of a sudden the build time is like 2 hours, 3 hours, which if I've made one change, I don't want to be, I can't wait for 2-3 hours, right, for a site to go live. So this is why we settled on, ended up settling on Next.js, because they have the concept of incremental static regeneration, which is where the page is built when the request comes in, and then it's cached. So if a page isn't popular, I'm not wasting time on doing the static build. The first visitor will get a bit of a lag because it's got to generate that page, but every subsequent visitor will get the benefit of it being served in cache. We're kind of used to this in the Sitecore world with the HTML caches built in, so the concept is again quite similar. And you can also just create yourself a very bog standard .NET Core application in a traditional way, which will just serve. A request comes in, it will just build a page, serve it out. Another one comes in, it builds a page, serves it out. You could layer on a CDN on top of that, and then if you wanted to, you could add in some custom logic to clear the caches. But you know what they say about cache invalidation. So just be a little bit wary about dealing with that problem.
Yeah, and then from a serverless functions, there's a lot of functionality for these static sites that you have to do, whether it's statically regenerated or even like pure static sites. They still have to call something to do things. So for forms, for being able to process data, for doing a lot of things where each system is talking to each other in webhooks, you might have to mediate in terms of what they need to do. You might have to do additional processing. All of that is done using the serverless functions. Now, you can write serverless functions in a lot of things. So for instance, we primarily use Azure Functions just because it's .NET. We could also do PowerShell functions and other kinds of functions. But you can also do Azure Functions, serverless functions in other technologies. So AWS Lambda provides you a way to do Azure functions in .NET Core, as well as Node and other other functionalities. So like Vercel, Netlify, Cloudflare, and all, there's several others. You can write your serverless functions in the language you're writing in. So for instance, for Vercel, we use some serverless functions for authorization using Next.js, and that's completely fine if you wanted to do that, but it gives you the option to automate things, option to do a lot of things. It's like the best way I can put it is, imagine you're writing a web service or an API endpoint in your MVC app. Your front end is basically calling the API to get things done. It's essentially exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So the page request lifecycle does change a bit with that typical Jamstack approach. With Sitecore, we're used to requests coming in, it gets handled by Sitecore. You then run it through the pipelines and processors and any other custom code you have in the renderings and your controllers. And you may be reaching out to custom databases, external systems, external services, or other external applications, and process that request. You generate some HTML and then return that out to the user, right? And maybe you have some caching in there and a CDN in there. But that's the typical kind of life cycle. With the Jamstack approach, it is a bit different. So if you're using the static site generation, you're pre-building all your markup, or in a similar concept to the incremental static regeneration. The basic concept is somebody makes a request, everybody gets the same initial response. Everybody gets the same HTML response back. And then this is where the Jamstack, the JavaScript and the API part comes in. You may be calling out to using REST services to different composable services, or maybe you have some custom functionality via Azure Serverless Functions, which can reach out to your custom databases, other external services, and they will then return that data to the user. The JavaScript then renders that back up onto the page. I mentioned earlier, you might be used to a similar kind of approach for some of your pages. Like if you have a search results page, that may be calling out to an API endpoint, which again might be hosted directly on Sitecore, using some JavaScript. You call those APIs, you'll fetch a bunch of results, you render it on the page, hit the next page to get the next set of results, and it will just call backwards and forwards. We don't have to deal with any of the CDNs because Vercel and the caching. Vercel will just handle all of that for us. So the lifecycle, you need to think about that lifecycle differently. You're now moving dynamic functionality onto the front end via REST services and APIs, rather than putting that directly into your pipelines. So just wrapping up, I think one of the things that is guaranteed in IT is change. We've been in this industry for a while, and we've been through lots of iterations in terms of just languages, right? I started off as just writing static HTML in Microsoft front page as my very first job as an intern. Went to classic ASP and then moved up the ranks to ASP.NET Web Forms, and then MVC, and then reaching out to lots of different systems. Did some JavaScript, was a full stack developer for a little while. We are guaranteed change. It's not a case of if, but when. The Sitecore platform, at least a core part of it, has been quite stable and quite the same for ever since I've been in Sitecore, since version 6. They've added external services to it, but that core platform has remained. So it was always a matter of when that change would come. But I think it's important to find your stack, find the system and the technologies that work well for you and for your team. It's going to be different for all of us. You've been doing a lot of these concepts, these composable concepts all along anyway. You've been integrating with external systems, you've been integrated with little components on the front end, which are Jamstacky almost. It's important to focus on the client and the project needs. Don't worry about the technology at the beginning. As long as you can find the technology sets that work well for the client, you're more likely to have more success on that project. And obviously reach out to the community. We're all going through this as well. We personally had a lot of experience doing some of this. So, if you want some advice, do reach out to us. We're always available on Slack or Twitter, or send us a message on any of those open platforms. And yeah, we'll jump to questions. And say you have a DX community available. Feel free to connect and join us in this community, and we'll be sharing a lot of info around Composable as well. Thank you.
Great session. Thank you. I think we have one question in the chat. Have you come across a scenario where you have to take a call for Vercel licensing and your experience with Vercel?
Yeah, I mean, we take calls for licensing with them quite a bit. It all depends on the people you're dealing with, right? So the person we deal with, or the group we deal with, we haven't had any issues really. And Vercel is something you could, like in this Jamstack composable world, it truly depends on what you use, right? So if you're using Gatsby, for instance, you don't have to be specific to Vercel. You have like Netlify, other vendors you can look into. You can roll your own as well. I think the biggest thing for us is because we work a lot with Next. Next works on Netlify as well, but you have to install their module. You don't get a full support like you do on Vercel. So we tend to go more with Vercel just because of our Next.js, and we have decent experience. Sometimes the pricing doesn't work out. If it doesn't work out, then we tend to go towards custom role. So like either going with another provider and adding something on, but so far we've had the pleasure of just working with Vercel itself.
Great.
Yeah, and typically doesn't matter if you go with Vercel or Netlify or whatever it is. Typically, we found that the hosting costs themselves are a lot less than you would get with Azure. Obviously, a lot of us are probably not used to taking these hosting calls anymore, because you just jump onto Azure and just spin up whatever instances you need. But those of us in the partner world will also be dealing with calls with Microsoft, for example. They deal with hosting as well.
Yeah. All right. Is there any other question? Looks like not. We are out of time here, but guys, thank you so much for a great presentation here. It was very informative, and like, as Maulik said, we'll have a recording, so we'll publish that, and that will be in the social. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.